On the windswept rim of Utah's canyon country, a pregnant widow named Nora McBride made a choice that would change everything. When she found the most feared outlaw in 3 territories bleeding to death against her corral, she didn't reach for her husband's rifle. Instead, she wrapped him in her mother's quilt so he could die with dignity. Black, Elias Kincaid had robbed banks from Denver to Salt Lake, left lawmen dead in dusty streets, and terrorized settlements for 20 years. But in his final moments, he felt something he'd forgotten existed: human kindness. By sunset, 700 of his scattered gang had surrounded Nora's humble dugout, their rifles catching the last light. But when they saw their leader wrapped in that simple patchwork quilt, something unprecedented happened. What could possibly make the most dangerous men in the West lay down their weapons for one woman's act of mercy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that would change everything began, like any other, for Nora McBride. With the familiar ache in her lower back and the weight of 7 months' pregnancy pressing against her ribs, she stood at the single window of her sod dugout, watching the sun paint the canyon rim in shades of amber and rose, her hands cradling the swell of her belly, where her late husband's child stirred restlessly. At 46, Nora had never expected to carry a baby. She and Thomas had tried for 23 years of marriage, their hopes dimming with each passing season until they'd made peace with childlessness. Then, 3 months after burying Thomas beneath the twisted juniper behind their home, she'd felt the first flutter of life within her womb, the answer to his final prayer, arriving like a whisper from beyond the grave. The dugout carved into the canyon wall had been Thomas's pride, though others might have called it humble. 12 feet square with walls of prairie sod stacked thick as a man's arm, it stayed cool in summer and held warmth through the bitter mountain winters. Thomas had lined the interior with smooth planks salvaged from a wrecked freight wagon, and Nora had sewn feed sack curtains that filtered the harsh light into something gentler. The cast-iron stove, hauled up from Salt Lake City in pieces, occupied one corner like a faithful friend, its chimney pipe threading through the sod roof to carry smoke into the endless sky. Their few possessions spoke of a life lived simply but with intention. Thomas's worn Bible rested on the rough-hewn table he'd built with his own hands, its pages marked with pressed wildflowers and margin notes written in his careful script. Nora's rocking chair, a wedding gift from her mother, faced the window where she could watch the weather build over the distant peaks. The quilt folded across its back had been pieced by 3 generations of women in her family, her grandmother's steady hands joining her mother's artistic eye and her own patient stitches in a pattern called wedding ring, its interlocking circles representing the unbroken bonds of love. The harsh beauty of their canyon home had suited them both. Thomas had chosen this remote spot for its isolation, far from the growing towns where a man's past might catch up with him. He'd never spoken of what he'd left behind, and Nora had never asked. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, and love was built on trust, not interrogation. What mattered was the man he'd become: gentle with animals, patient with the rocky soil, and devoted to the woman who'd chosen to share his exile. Their nearest neighbors, the Kellys, lived 8 miles down the canyon where the walls opened into a small valley. Patrick Kelly ran a few head of cattle and served as the unofficial postmaster, riding to the territorial capital twice a month to collect mail and supplies. His wife Margaret had delivered 3 babies in her kitchen and served as midwife for every woman within a day's ride. At 62, she'd promised to attend Nora's birth, though the journey grew more difficult each year. The isolation that had comforted Thomas sometimes weighed heavily on Nora, especially now with the baby coming. She'd grown up in a bustling household in Missouri, the eldest of 6 children, where conversation flowed like water and silence was a rare commodity. Here, days could pass without hearing another human voice, the canyon walls echoing only with wind and the distant cry of hawks. She'd learned to find companionship in small things, the family of ground squirrels that lived beneath her woodpile, the ravens that followed the same flight path each morning, the way shadows moved across the canyon floor like a slow dance. Thomas had been gone 8 months now, taken by a fever that started as a simple cold. She'd nursed him through worse, but this time something vital had broken inside him, as if he'd been holding on just long enough to plant the seed of their child. In his final days, he'd spoken often of the baby, his eyes bright with certainty that God wouldn't take him without leaving something precious behind. "She'll be strong like her mother," he'd whispered, his calloused hand resting on Nora's still flat belly. "And stubborn like her father. Teach her to be kind, Nora. The world has enough hardness already." Nora had promised, though she wondered how she'd manage alone. The garden Thomas had coaxed from the rocky soil provided vegetables through the growing season, and she'd learned to preserve enough to last the winter. Her small flock of chickens gave eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. The milk cow, a gentle Jersey named Bessie, had been Thomas's particular pride, and she'd proven surprisingly easy to manage. The rifle hanging above the door had never been fired in anger, but Nora knew how to load and aim it, if necessity demanded. Money came from the quilts she pieced during the long winter evenings, intricate patterns that city women coveted for their beauty and craftsmanship. Margaret Kelly carried them to Salt Lake City on her infrequent trips, returning with enough cash to buy flour, coffee, and the few store-bought necessities their isolated life required. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, each tiny stitch a meditation on patience and hope. The baby's movements had grown stronger in recent weeks, sometimes keeping her awake with enthusiastic kicks and turns. She'd taken to talking to the child, describing the world that waited beyond the canyon walls, the family stories that connected them to something larger than their small slice of earth. Her own mother had died when Nora was barely 16, but the memory of her gentle voice and steady hands remained vivid. The quilt that now warmed Nora's bed had been her mother's final gift, completed during the long illness that finally claimed her. This morning, as Nora prepared her simple breakfast of cornbread and honey, she felt the familiar tightness across her belly that meant the baby was growing restless. 7 months along, with 2 more to go, and already she could barely see her feet. Margaret had warned her that first babies often came late, which meant she might be carrying this burden into the heat of full summer. The thought of laboring alone in the dugout sometimes woke her in the middle of the night, her heart racing with fears she couldn't voice. What if complications arose? What if the baby came early, before Margaret could make the journey? What if she died in childbirth, leaving Thomas's child an orphan in this harsh country? These were the thoughts that plagued her in the dark hours before dawn, when the canyon walls seemed to press closer and the weight of her solitude felt unbearable. But morning always brought renewed courage. Thomas had believed in her strength, had trusted her to raise their child with wisdom and love. She would not disappoint him, would not let fear steal the joy from this unexpected blessing. The baby kicked again, as if sensing her thoughts, and Nora smiled despite her worries. "Good morning, little one," she murmured, her hands tracing the familiar curve of her belly. "Your papa always said this was God's country, and I reckon you'll find it beautiful when you're ready to see it." The wind picked up outside, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of weather from the distant mountains. Nora pulled her shawl tighter and moved to the window, watching the play of light and shadow across the canyon floor. Somewhere out there, beyond the red rock walls and endless sky, the world continued its busy pace. But here, in this quiet sanctuary Thomas had built for them, time moved differently. Here, a woman could grow a child in peace, surrounded by the eternal rhythms of earth and sky. She didn't know, as she stood watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls, that this would be the last morning of her old life. Didn't know that within hours, an act of simple mercy would transform her from an isolated widow into the center of a story that would echo through the territory for generations. All she knew was the baby's gentle stirring beneath her heart and the promise of another day in the home her husband had built for love. The rifle above the door caught a gleam of morning light, and Nora wondered, not for the first time, if she'd have the courage to use it if trouble came calling. Thomas had taught her to shoot, his patient instruction turning her from a frightened city girl into a woman who could put meat on the table when necessity demanded. But shooting game for food was different from pointing a weapon at another human being. She prayed she'd never have to find out which kind of woman she truly was. As the sun climbed higher, Nora began her daily routine, unaware that everything was about to change. The gunfire shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. Nora dropped her coffee cup, the tin clattering against the wooden floor as the sharp crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls. 3 shots, then 4 more in rapid succession, the sound bouncing and amplifying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly as the baby kicked in response to her sudden fear. More shots followed, closer now, accompanied by the thunder of hoofbeats and men's voices raised in anger or pain. Nora reached for Thomas's rifle above the door, her hands trembling as she checked the load. Through the window, she could see dust rising beyond the corral, where their small remuda of horses milled nervously, ears pricked toward the approaching chaos. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the wind and the frightened whickering of horses. Nora pressed herself against the window frame, trying to see beyond the corral without exposing herself to whatever danger lurked in the morning shadows. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the rasp of her own breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. Then she saw him. A horse and rider had collapsed against the far side of the corral, the animal down and motionless, the man slumped forward across its neck. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stains spreading across his shirt, could see the way his body shook with each labored breath. Blood pooled in the dust beneath them, black as tar in the morning light. Nora's first instinct was to barricade herself inside the dugout and pray that whoever had shot the man would ride on without noticing her home carved into the canyon wall. The sensible thing would be to stay hidden until she was certain the danger had passed. A pregnant woman alone had no business involving herself in whatever violence had brought shooting to her quiet canyon. But as she watched, the wounded man raised his head slightly, and she caught a glimpse of his face pale as parchment, eyes glazed with pain and approaching death. He was young, maybe 30, with dark hair matted with sweat and blood. His mouth moved as if he were trying to speak, though no sound carried across the distance between them. The sight of his suffering pierced something deep in Nora's chest. Thomas had always said that mercy was the highest calling, that turning away from another's pain diminished a person's own humanity. She could almost hear his voice now, gentle but firm. A life is a life, Nora. God doesn't ask us to judge who deserves his compassion. The rifle felt heavy in her hands as she wrestled with her conscience. This man could be anyone, a rustler, a murderer, one of the outlaws that territorial newspapers wrote about with breathless fear. He could be dangerous even in his wounded state, could bring more violence down on her head. But he could also be someone's son, someone's husband, bleeding to death in her front yard while she cowered inside her home. The baby kicked again, and Nora made her choice. She set the rifle aside and pulled her mother's quilt from the rocking chair, the wedding ring pattern bright against her dark dress. The quilt had kept 3 generations of her family warm through cold nights and difficult times. If this was to be its final service, perhaps that was fitting. The morning air carried a chill that cut through her thin shawl as she stepped outside. Her pregnancy made her movements awkward, but determination gave her strength as she crossed the hard-packed earth toward the fallen rider. Up close, she could see that his horse had been shot multiple times, the poor beast's suffering mercifully ended. The man was another matter entirely. He was conscious but fading fast, his breathing shallow and irregular. 3 bullet wounds that she could see, one in his shoulder, one in his side, and another high on his chest that frothed pink with each exhale. His clothes were well made but travel-stained, his boots expensive leather worn thin by hard riding. A gun belt circled his waist, but the holster was empty, the weapon lost somewhere in his flight from whoever had been hunting him. When Nora knelt beside him, his eyes focused on her face with surprising clarity. They were brown eyes, she noticed, dark as creek water and filled with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. He tried to speak, his lips forming words that came out as barely a whisper. "Ma'am," he managed, each word an obvious effort. "Didn't mean to bring trouble to your door." "Hush now," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Save your strength." She began to unfold the quilt, its familiar weight and texture comforting in her hands. The man watched her movements with growing amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "You don't know who I am," he whispered. "I know you're hurt and dying," Nora replied, spreading the quilt over his broken body. "That's all that matters right now." Something shifted in his expression then, a softening that made him look younger despite the grey pallor of approaching death. His hand, streaked with blood and dirt, reached up to touch the edge of the quilt where her grandmother's careful stitches joined 2 rings of blue calico. "Beautiful work," he murmured, and Nora was surprised by the genuine appreciation in his voice. My mother made quilts. Haven't thought about that in a long time." "What's your name?" Nora asked, though she suspected it might be better not to know. He was quiet for so long that she thought he'd lost consciousness. Then his eyes opened again, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Elias," he said finally. "Elias Kincaid." The name hit Nora like a physical blow. Even in her isolated canyon, she'd heard stories of Black Elias Kincaid, the outlaw who'd robbed more banks than any man in 3 territories, who'd left a trail of dead lawmen and terrified townsfolk from Colorado to California. The newspapers painted him as a monster, a man without conscience or mercy who killed as easily as other men drew breath. But the man lying beneath her mother's quilt didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's lost son, dying alone and far from home. "You should run," Kincaid whispered, his voice growing weaker. "When they find me, when they see what you've done, it won't go easy for you." "Who's they?" Nora asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "My boys," he said, and there was something like affection in the words. 700 of the hardest men you'll ever see, scattered from here to Denver. When word gets out that Black Elias is dead, they'll come looking for whoever killed me." "I didn't kill you," Nora pointed out gently. Kincaid's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "No, ma'am, you surely didn't. You're the first person in 20 years to show me kindness, expecting nothing in return." His hand tightened on the quilt's edge. "They'll see this. They'll know." "Know what?" "That somebody cared enough to let me die warm." The words were so simple, so quietly spoken, that their impact didn't hit Nora immediately. When it did, she felt tears burning her eyes. How long had it been since this Manthis, feared outlaw had experienced simple human compassion? How many years had he lived expecting nothing but bullets and betrayal? Kincaid's breathing grew more labored, each exhale a struggle. "Ma'am?" "Yes?" "Thank you." They were his last words. Nora sat with him as the sun climbed higher, her hand resting on the quilt that rose and fell with his failing breath until it finally stilled. When she was certain he was gone, she closed his eyes and pulled the quilt up to cover his face. Only then did she notice the dust cloud rising in the distance riders, approaching fast, their numbers impossible to count from her position. Kincaid's boys were coming, just as he'd promised. 700 of the most dangerous men in the West, riding to find their leader's body wrapped in a quilt, stitched by loving hands. Nora struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her aching back, and looked down at the peaceful figure beneath the wedding ring pattern. She'd made her choice based on mercy, not calculation. Now she would live or die with the consequences. The dust cloud grew larger, and Nora McBride went inside to wait for whatever came next. The first riders appeared on the canyon rim just after noon, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. Nora watched from her window as they sat motionless on their horses, studying the scene below. Even from a distance, she could sense their tension, the way they held themselves ready for violence. More came throughout the afternoon, single riders and small groups, emerging from draws and hidden trails that Nora hadn't known existed. They took positions along the canyon walls like sentries, their rifles glinting in the slanted light. By evening, the rim was crowded with armed men, their numbers growing with each passing hour. But none of them approached the dugout, none of them fired a shot. Nora had expected an immediate assault, bullets smashing through her windows and door. Instead, she found herself in the center of the strangest siege in frontier history, surrounded by hundreds of outlaws who seemed content to simply watch and wait. As darkness fell, she lit her oil lamp and tried to make sense of the situation. Through the window, she could see the glow of campfires dotting the canyon rim, could hear the low murmur of voices and the occasional whinny of horses. The outlaws had made camp, as if they planned to stay indefinitely. It was then that she remembered Kincaid's pocket watch. She'd noticed it earlier, the silver chain visible beneath his vest, but hadn't thought to examine it while he lay dying. Now, with time to think, she realized it might hold clues to the man's true nature and, perhaps, to the intentions of the army gathering outside her door. Moving carefully in the lamplight, Nora approached Kincaid's body. The quilt covered him completely, but she could see the outline of his form beneath the familiar pattern. With gentle hands, she pulled back the fabric and located the watch chain. The timepiece was heavier than she'd expected, its silver case worn smooth by years of handling. On the back, engraved in careful script, were the words, "For Papa, with all my love, Sarah." Nora's breath caught in her throat. Papa, this feared outlaw, this man whose name struck terror into the hearts of frontier towns, had been someone's father. The watch face bore the marks of careful maintenance, its hands still keeping perfect time. This was no trinket grabbed in a robbery. This was a treasured keepsake, polished by loving hands and carried close to the heart. A soft knock at her door made her jump, nearly dropping the watch. She quickly covered Kincaid's body again and moved toward the sound, her heart hammering. The knock came again, gentle but insistent. "Ma'am?" The voice was weathered but respectful. "Ma'am, I'd like a word if you're willing." Nora considered her options. She could ignore the caller and hope he'd go away, but that seemed unlikely given the circumstances. Better to face whatever came next with dignity than to cower in her own home. "Who's there?" she called through the door. "Name's Jake Morrison, ma'am. I rode with Elias for 15 years. I'm not here to hurt you." Nora gripped the watch tightly, drawing courage from its unexpected revelation. "Are you alone?" "Yes, ma'am. Got my hands where you can see them." She opened the door to find a grizzled man in his 50s, his hat in his hands and his gun belt conspicuously absent. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, but his manner was surprisingly courteous. "Ma'am," Morrison said, nodding respectfully, "I wonder if I might come in. I've got questions, and I reckon you might have some answers." Against her better judgment, Nora stepped aside. Morrison entered slowly, his eyes immediately finding Kincaid's covered form. His face went very still. "The boys on the rim say you wrapped him in that quilt," Morrison said quietly. "That true?" "Yes." "Mind if I ask why?" Nora studied the man's weathered features, searching for signs of deception or violence. What she saw instead was genuine puzzlement, as if he were trying to solve a riddle that defied understanding. "He was dying," she said simply. "Seemed like the right thing to do." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Nora and the quilted form. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what you've done here. I showed mercy to a dying man, nothing more. That man was Elias Kincaid, Black Elias. You know what that means?" "I know his reputation." Morrison shook his head slowly. "His reputation don't tell the half of it. That man was harder than winter iron, could kill 3 men before they cleared leather. He's robbed more banks than I can count, left a trail of bodies from here to San Francisco, and you covered him with your grandmother's quilt so he could die comfortable." The way Morrison said it, with a mixture of awe and disbelief, made Nora realize that her simple act of mercy had implications she'd never considered. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "Something you need to know about Elias, about why the boys are sitting up there instead of burning this place to the ground." Nora waited, the watch heavy in her hand. "Elias never had a family of his own. Lost his wife and daughter to cholera when he was barely 25. That's what turned him hard, what started him on the outlaw trail. But he treated us like family. Every man who rode with him was a brother, a son. He'd die for any one of us, and we'd do the same for him. Morrison's voice grew softer. 20 years I've known that man, and I never once saw him accept kindness from a stranger. Never saw him trust anyone who wasn't part of our outfit. But you wrapped him in that quilt, and he let you. That means something to the boys, something they can't quite put into words. What are you saying? I'm saying that every man on that rim would have followed Elias into hell itself, and now they're looking at a woman who showed him the kind of mercy he never knew existed. They don't know what to make of it, but they respect it. That's why you're still breathing. Nora pulled the watch from her pocket and held it out. This was his. I thought you might want it back. Morrison stared at the timepiece, his eyes widening. Where did you find this? In his vest pocket. It's engraved from someone named Sarah. Sarah was his daughter, Morrison whispered, taking the watch with trembling hands. She was 6 when the cholera took her. He's carried this watch every day since, wound it every morning like a prayer. I didn't even know he still had it. The revelation hung between them like a bridge, spanning an impossible gulf. Nora began to understand the magnitude of what she'd witnessed. Not just the death of a notorious outlaw, but the passing of a man who'd carried his grief for 20 years, whose hardness had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss. What happens now? She asked. Morrison looked toward the door, toward the canyon rim, where hundreds of armed men waited for word. That depends on you, ma'am. The boys are expecting answers, and I'm the one who has to give them. What do you want me to tell them? Nora thought of Kincaid's last words, his gratitude for a simple act of human kindness. She thought of the watch, carried faithfully for 20 years, in memory of a lost child. Most of all, she thought of Thomas's gentle voice. The world has enough hardness already. Tell them the truth, she said. Tell them their leader died with dignity, wrapped in love that was pieced together by 3 generations of women who believed in hope. Morrison nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I believe I will. Dawn brought more riders, their numbers swelling until the canyon rim resembled a vast encampment. Nora counted campfires by the dozen, smoke rising in thin columns against the morning sky. Jake Morrison had been true to his word. He'd carried news of Kincaid's peaceful death to the assembled outlaws, and somehow that news had stayed their hands. But it had also brought consequences Nora hadn't anticipated. She woke to sharp pains shooting across her belly, the kind that made her gasp and grip the edge of her bed. The stress of the past day, combined with the sleepless night, spent listening to the murmur of voices from the canyon rim, had taken its toll on her body. At 7 months pregnant, she couldn't afford complications, but fear and exhaustion were proving stronger than her will to remain calm. The cross Thomas had carved from juniper wood hung on the wall beside their bed, its simple lines, a reminder of faith tested by circumstance. He'd made it during his final illness, his hands still steady despite the fever that would soon claim him. For when you need to remember that love is stronger than fear, he'd told her, pressing the smooth wood into her palm. Now, as another contraction gripped her, Nora traced the cross's familiar outline and tried to find that strength. A commotion outside drew her attention to the window. More men were arriving, but these weren't the rough-dressed riders who'd been gathering since yesterday. These newcomers wore the clean clothes and polished boots of townsmen, their horses fresh and well-fed. Even from a distance, she could see the glint of badges on their chests. Law enforcement had arrived. The sight of uniformed marshals and territorial deputies mixing with hundreds of wanted men should have erupted in immediate violence. Instead, Nora watched in amazement as the 2 groups maintained a tense but peaceful separation. The outlaws remained on the north rim, while the lawmen took positions on the south wall, with her humble dugout occupying the no-man's land between them. Another knock at her door interrupted her observations. This time the caller was a woman's voice, familiar and welcome. "Nora, dear, it's Margaret Kelly. Open up, child." Nora hurried to let in her neighbor, grateful beyond words for the sight of the older woman's competent face. Margaret carried her midwife's bag and wore the determined expression that had seen her through countless frontier crises. "Margaret, how did you get here? The canyon's full of armed men." "Rode right through them," Margaret said matter-of-factly, setting down her bag and studying Nora's pale face. "Amazing thing not. One of those outlaws tried to stop me. Fact is, they seemed right, respectful, tipping their hats and wishing me well. What in blazes have you done, Nora McBride?" Nora explained the events of the previous day while Margaret examined her, the older woman's practiced hands checking for signs of premature labor. The cross on the wall seemed to catch more light as she spoke, as if Thomas himself were listening to the story of how mercy had transformed their quiet canyon into the center of an unprecedented standoff. "Braxton Hicks contractions," Margaret pronounced after her examination. "False labor brought on by stress. But we need to keep you calm, or these could turn into the real thing. 7 months is too early for this baby to come." "How can I stay calm with an army outside my door?" Margaret moved to the window and surveyed the scene with the pragmatic eye of a frontier woman who'd seen everything twice. "Those men aren't here to hurt you, child. Look at them, really look." Nora joined her at the window, studying the outlaws' positions more carefully. Margaret was right. The men weren't arranged for an attack. They were arranged for defense, their weapons trained outward toward the approaching lawmen, rather than inward toward the dugout. "They're protecting me," Nora whispered in amazement. "Seems that way. Question is, how long can they keep it up?" As if summoned by her words, Jake Morrison appeared at the door again, this time accompanied by a tall man in a marshal's uniform. The lawman was young, maybe 30, with the kind of rigid bearing that spoke of military training and absolute certainty in his own righteousness. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "this here's Marshal David Brennan. He's got some questions about yesterday's events." Brennan stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Mrs. McBride, I'm investigating reports of harboring a known fugitive. I need to see the body." "He wasn't harbored," Nora replied firmly. "He was dying when I found him. Nevertheless, I need to examine the remains and take your statement. You're in serious legal jeopardy here." Margaret Kelly stepped between them, her small frame radiating protective fury. "Marshal, this woman is 7 months pregnant and suffering from stress-induced contractions. Your investigation can wait until she's received proper medical attention." "I'm afraid it can't. The territorial governor has ordered." "The territorial governor can go whistle," Margaret snapped. "I've been a midwife for 30 years, and I'm telling you that further stress could kill both mother and child. Are you prepared to explain 2 deaths to your superiors?" Brennan's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. "Very well, but I'll be posting guards to ensure no one interferes with evidence." "Marshal," Morrison interjected quietly, "might I suggest you reconsider that position? Are you threatening a federal officer?" "No, sir. Just pointing out reality. You've got maybe 20 men down there. I've got 700 up here, and more arriving every hour. Your guards wouldn't last 5 minutes if the boys decided they didn't like the arrangement." The truth of Morrison's words hung in the air like smoke. Brennan might have the law on his side, but he was vastly outnumbered by men who'd spent their lives evading legal authority. His only advantage was the bizarre situation that had the outlaws maintaining a peaceful vigil instead of asserting their superior numbers. "Why are they here?" Brennan demanded. "What's so special about this woman that hundreds of criminals are willing to risk capture?" Morrison looked at Nora, then at the quilt-covered form that had drawn so many desperate men to this remote canyon. She showed kindness to their leader in his final moments. That means something to men who've never known mercy themselves. "Kindness?" Brennan's voice dripped with disdain. "That man was a murderer and a thief. He deserved to die in the dirt like the animal he was." The words hung in the sudden silence, like a challenge. Through the window, Nora could see outlaws turning toward the dugout, their postures shifting from watchful to threatening. Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun. "Marshal," Morrison said very quietly. "I'd advise you to choose your next words carefully. There are men on that rim who'd kill you for what you just said, and I'm not sure I'd try to stop them." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Margaret moved protectively closer to Nora, whose contractions had intensified with the rising conflict. The cross on the wall seemed to pulse with golden light, and Nora found herself thinking of Thomas's final words about teaching their child to be kind in a world that had enough hardness already. "Marshal," she said, her voice steady despite the pain, "what if I told you that Elias Kincaid died, asking forgiveness for his sins? What if his last words were gratitude for a simple act of human decency? Would that change how you see this situation?" Brennan stared at her, his certainty wavering for the first time. Around them, the canyon held its breath, waiting to see whether mercy or justice would prevail in the strange sanctuary where love had been stitched into a quilt by 3 generations of believing women. By the 3rd day, the canyon had transformed into something unprecedented in the annals of the American frontier, a place where the most wanted men in 3 territories maintained an uneasy peace with federal law enforcement, all centered around a pregnant widow's act of mercy. Nora had taken to sitting by her window with a collection of yellowed wanted posters that Marshal Brennan had left behind, studying the faces of the men who now served as her unlikely protectors. The papers painted a gallery of violence and crime bank robberies, train holdups, murders, and cattle rustling stretching back decades. Yet when she looked up at the canyon rim, she saw something different in their campfires and quiet conversations. She saw grief. Jake Morrison had become her primary liaison with the assembled outlaws, visiting twice daily to check on her welfare and coordinate with Margaret Kelly's medical concerns. Through their conversations, Nora began to understand the complex web of loyalty that held Kincaid's scattered gang together across vast distances and years of separation. "Most of these men have been riding together for 15-20 years, Morrison explained during one of his visits. Elias didn't just lead them, he saved them. Took in boys running from bad homes, men who'd lost everything to drought or foreclosure, soldiers who came back from the war with nothing but nightmares. He gave them purpose, gave them family. And now they've lost their father," Nora observed, her hand resting on her swollen belly, where her own child stirred restlessly. "That's about the size of it. 700 men, and every one of them would have taken a bullet for Elias. Now they don't know what to do with all that loyalty." The wanted posters told stories of desperation and violence, but Morrison's words revealed a different narrative, one of men bound together by shared loss and mutual protection. Still, the sheer scope of their criminal activity was staggering. Train robberies from Colorado to California, bank jobs that had funded entire communities of outlaws, cattle operations that had redistributed wealth from railroad barons to frontier families. "Were they really as dangerous as these papers claim?" Nora asked, holding up a poster that offered a $1,000 reward for Morrison himself. "Dangerous? Yes, ma'am. But not evil. There's a difference most folks don't understand." Margaret Kelly, who'd taken up temporary residence in the dugout to monitor Nora's condition, snorted her disagreement. "Dangerous men with guns are evil enough for decent people. Respectfully, ma'am, you don't know what drove most of these boys to the outlaw trail. When the law fails you, when banks steal your land and badges protect the thieves, sometimes a man's got to make his own justice." The philosophical debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by commotion from the canyon rim. Through the window, they could see riders approaching from the east, not the rough-dressed outlaws who'd been trickling in for days, but a formal procession flying territorial and federal flags. Marshal Brennan had sent for reinforcements. The new arrivals numbered perhaps 50 territorial militia and federal marshals, led by a figure Nora recognized from newspaper illustrations. Colonel James Wittman, the territorial administrator whose iron-fisted approach to frontier lawlessness had earned him both fear and respect across the West. Morrison's face went grim as he watched the official party take positions on the South Rim. "This changes things considerable. Wittman's not the type to negotiate with outlaws." "What will happen?" Nora asked, though she feared the answer. War, most likely. Wittman's brought enough men to make a fight of it, and he's got the kind of reputation that won't let him back down from criminals. The boys up there know it too, see how they're checking their weapons, repositioning for better cover. Indeed, the peaceful vigilance of the past 3 days was shifting into something more ominous. Rifle barrels glinted along the canyon rim as men who'd spent years evading capture prepared for what might be their final stand. "All because I covered a dying man with a quilt," Nora whispered. "No, ma'am," Morrison said firmly. "All because you showed mercy to someone the world had written off as beyond redemption. That's not something to regret." But as Colonel Wittman's amplified voice echoed across the canyon, demanding the immediate surrender of all wanted fugitives, Nora wondered if her simple act of kindness had doomed hundreds of men to death in a war that need never have been fought. The standoff that followed stretched nerves to the breaking point. Wittman's demands met with stony silence from the outlaw positions. No shots were fired, but the threat of violence hung over the canyon like a storm about to break. It was then that Nora made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going out there," she announced, struggling to her feet despite Margaret's protests. "You most certainly are not," the midwife declared. "One stray bullet could kill you and the baby both. If I don't, there'll be a lot more than one bullet fired. Those men are out there because of what I did. Maybe I can undo it." Morrison shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, this is beyond your control now. Wittman's not going to listen to a woman, especially one who sheltered his most wanted fugitive." "Then maybe I need to talk to someone who will listen." Before either of them could stop her, Nora walked to the wooden box where she kept her few precious possessions. From beneath her wedding photographs and Thomas's letters, she withdrew a small leather journal, his final gift to her, pages filled with his thoughts on faith, justice, and the responsibility of good people in an imperfect world. One passage in particular had stayed with her through the long months of widowhood. "The law is meant to serve justice, but when law becomes divorced from mercy, it serves only vengeance. A good person's duty is to remind the world that justice without compassion is merely cruelty, wearing official clothing." Thomas had written those words after witnessing a public hanging in Salt Lake City, where a young man had been executed for stealing food to feed his starving family. The memory of that day had haunted her husband, had been part of what drove him to seek isolation in their remote canyon. Now, as Nora read his words again, she felt his presence as surely as if he stood beside her. The cross on the wall caught the afternoon light, and she knew what she had to do. "I'm going to speak to Colonel Wittman," she announced, not as someone asking for mercy, but as someone offering it. Morrison and Margaret exchanged worried glances, but something in Nora's voice convinced them that argument would be futile. The pregnant widow, who'd shown kindness to a dying outlaw, had found her own strength, and nothing they could say would turn her from her chosen path. As she prepared to walk into the no-man's land between two armies, Nora clutched Thomas's journal and prayed that his words about justice and mercy might somehow bridge the gap between law and compassion in a canyon where 700 desperate men waited to learn whether kindness could triumph over violence. Colonel James Wittman was not a man accustomed to having his authority questioned, particularly not by pregnant widows in remote canyons. At 58, he'd spent 30 years bringing order to the frontier through the application of overwhelming force and unwavering resolve. His reputation had been built on the simple principle that lawlessness, in any form, deserved swift and decisive punishment. The badge pinned to his military-style jacket represented more than just his authority, as territorial administrator it symbolized his absolute faith in the righteousness of legal justice. Polished to mirror brightness and worn with obvious pride, it had witnessed the hanging of dozens of outlaws, the breaking of countless criminal enterprises, and the establishment of order in territories that had once known only chaos. Now, as he stood on the canyon's south rim, studying the unprecedented situation below, that badge seemed to weigh heavier than usual. 700 wanted criminals had gathered in response to one woman's act of mercy, and somehow that mercy had stayed their hands where his authority had never succeeded in doing. "Sir," Marshal Brennan reported, approaching with obvious nervousness. "The woman wants to speak with you, says she has information about the situation that might change your perspective." Wittman lowered his field glasses and considered the request. In 3 decades of frontier law enforcement, he'd never encountered anything quite like this standoff. Criminals were supposed to run when confronted with superior force, not maintain peaceful vigils around the scene of their leader's death. "What kind of information?" he asked. "She won't say, sir, but she's carrying some sort of journal, and she seems convinced it's relevant to our situation." Wittman studied the dugout below, where Nora McBride stood in her doorway like a small figure of defiance against the vast machinery of territorial justice. Something about her posture straight-backed, despite her pregnancy, calm, despite the armed camp surrounding her, reminded him uncomfortably of his own mother, who'd faced down claim jumpers in Kansas with nothing but moral authority and stubborn courage. "Very well, but she comes to me, not the reverse. I won't have it said that a territorial administrator negotiated from a position of weakness." 20 minutes later, Nora made her way slowly up the steep canyon path, her pregnancy making the climb difficult, but her determination evident in every careful step. Margaret Kelly had insisted on accompanying her part way, though the midwife stopped at the base of the trail with obvious reluctance. "Remember," Margaret had whispered, "you're not just speaking for yourself now. That baby you're carrying represents the future. Make sure these men understand what kind of world they're choosing to create." As Nora approached Wittman's position, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her outlaws and lawmen alike, watching to see how this unprecedented meeting would unfold. The journal clutched in her hands felt warm, as if Thomas's words retained some measure of his living presence. Wittman received her with military formality, his officers arranged in a semicircle that spoke of protocol and chain of command. Up close, the territorial badge on his chest seemed larger, more imposing, a symbol of authority that had never been successfully challenged. "Mrs. McBride," he said with stiff courtesy, "Marshal Brennan tells me you have information relevant to this situation." "I do, Colonel. But first, I want to understand something. What exactly do you hope to accomplish here?" The directness of her question caught Wittman off guard. "I intend to arrest every wanted fugitive in this canyon and see them face justice for their crimes. All 700 of them, if necessary." Nora opened Thomas's journal to a page marked with a pressed, wildflower reminder of the gentleness that had defined her husband's character, even in his final days. "My late husband wrote something I think you should hear. The law is meant to serve justice, but when law becomes divorced from mercy, it serves only vengeance. A good person's duty is to remind the world that justice, without compassion, is merely cruelty wearing official clothing." Wittman's jaw tightened. "Mrs. McBride, I appreciate your loss, but philosophy has no place in law enforcement. These men are criminals who've chosen to place themselves outside society's protection. Have they? Or has society placed them outside its protection first?" Before Wittman could respond, Nora continued, her voice gaining strength from the words she'd rehearsed during the difficult climb. "Colonel, what do you know about Elias Kincaid's life before he became an outlaw? I know he was a murderer and a thief. He was a father who lost his wife and daughter to cholera. He was a man who turned to crime only after the law failed to protect his family from those who would exploit their suffering. His daughter's name was Sarah, and he carried her watch for 20 years, not as a trophy of violence, but as a reminder of love lost." Wittman shifted uncomfortably, the absolute certainty that had guided his career beginning to waver. "Even if that's true, it doesn't excuse his crimes." "No, it doesn't, but it explains them. And more importantly, it explains why 700 men are willing to risk their lives to honor the memory of someone who showed him mercy in his final moments." She gestured toward the canyon rim, where the outlaws maintained their peaceful vigil. "Look at them, Colonel. Really look. They're not here for violence, they're here for something they've never experienced before. They're here because someone finally showed their leader the kindness that might have prevented him from becoming an outlaw in the first place. You're asking me to ignore my duty. I'm asking you to expand your understanding of what duty means. Thomas wrote something else in this journal. A badge should be worn as a reminder of responsibility, not as a shield against conscience. The words hit Wittman like a physical blow. His hand moved involuntarily to the polished badge on his chest, feeling its familiar weight in a new way. For 30 years, that badge had been his identity, his justification for decisions that had sometimes troubled his sleep. Now, a pregnant widow was suggesting that his unwavering application of legal authority might be a form of moral cowardice. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. "I'm proposing that we try something unprecedented. Instead of meeting their loyalty with violence, what if we met it with understanding? What if we acknowledged that justice can be served in ways that don't require bloodshed? And how exactly would that work?" Nora pulled another page from the journal, this one containing a list in Thomas's careful handwriting ideas he'd developed for reforming frontier justice after witnessing too many hangings that had solved nothing and healed no wounds. Restitution instead of retribution, community service instead of execution, the chance for men who've known only violence to build something instead of destroying it. Some of these men have skills. They could help build schools, churches, hospitals in territories that desperately need them. Wittman stared at the list, his military mind automatically calculating logistics and possibilities. It was radical, unprecedented, possibly illegal, according to territorial statutes. It was also, he realized with growing discomfort, possibly right. "Mrs. McBride," he said finally, "what you're suggesting would require me to ignore decades of legal precedent and risk my career on the questionable redemption of hardened criminals." "Yes," Nora agreed simply. "It would require you to choose mercy over vengeance, hope over hatred. It would require you to believe that people can change, that love is stronger than fear." The badge on Wittman's chest caught the afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in 30 years, he found himself questioning whether its weight represented strength or burden. Around them, the canyon held its breath, waiting to see whether justice and mercy could find common ground in the shadow of Thomas McBride's enduring faith in human redemption. The revelation came not from any dramatic confrontation or heated argument, but from a simple mistake that changed everything anyone thought they knew about Elias Kincaid. As Colonel Wittman struggled with Nora's challenge to his understanding of justice, Jake Morrison approached the group with obvious reluctance. In his weathered hands, he carried a leather saddlebag that had been overlooked in the initial examination of Kincaid's possessions. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, ma'am," Morrison said, his voice heavy with an emotion that hadn't been there before. "But there's something in Elias's gear that changes this whole situation. Something none of us knew about. Not even his closest men." Wittman accepted the saddlebag with the caution of a man who'd learned to expect surprises in frontier justice. The leather was worn soft by years of hard travel, its brass fittings green with age. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was a collection of items that told a story none of them had imagined. The first was a faded photograph, larger and clearer than the small image Morrison had described earlier. It showed a young Elias Kincaid, perhaps 25 years old, standing beside a woman of ethereal beauty. Between them, a small girl with dark curls and laughing eyes reached up toward her father's face. The family portrait radiated happiness, capturing a moment of pure joy before tragedy struck. But it was the accompanying documents that truly shattered their assumptions. "Marriage certificate," Wittman read aloud, his voice growing quieter with each revelation. "Elias Jonathan Kincaid to Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, June 15th, 1850. 1. He looked up sharply at Jake Morrison. "Morrison?" The grizzled outlaw nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My sister, Colonel. Sarah was my baby sister." The words fell into the canyon like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding through everyone present. Nora felt her baby stir restlessly as the implications began to dawn on her. "You're saying Elias Kincaid was your brother-in-law?" Wittman asked, though the evidence was clear before them. For 4 years, Morrison confirmed. 4 of the happiest years any man ever lived. Elias wasn't born to violence, Colonel. He was born to love. Sarah and little Hannah, that was their daughter's name, Hannah Sarah Kincaid, they were his whole world. The next document was a medical certificate, its official territorial seal authenticating a tragedy that had destroyed more than one life. Certificate of death, cholera epidemic. Recorded this day, Sarah Elizabeth Kincaid, age 22, Hannah Sarah Kincaid, age 4. Cause, Asiatic cholera. Attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, Territorial Medical Service. But it was the final document that revealed the true scope of the injustice that had created the legend of Black Elias Kincaid. Land seizure notice, Nora read, her voice barely above a whisper. Property of E.J. Kincaid to be sold at auction for unpaid medical debts resulting from cholera treatment. Bidding to commence, she stopped, reading the date twice to be certain. This is dated 3 days after the death certificate. Wittman's military bearing faltered as the implications became clear. They seized his land while his family was still being buried. Morrison's voice cracked with 20 years of suppressed grief. Dr. Webb charged Elias $500 for treating Sarah and Hannah, money he didn't have. Money nobody in that part of the territory had. When the cholera took them anyway, Webb demanded payment from their estate. The territorial court backed him up, said medical debts took precedence over homestead rights. So they stole his land to pay for treatments that didn't save his family, Nora said, understanding flooding through her. Worse than that, the auction was fixed. Webb bought the property himself for $20, then sold it to the railroad for $2,000. Elias lost everything, his wife, his daughter, his home, his future. Also, a doctor and a judge could get rich off his grief. The photograph seemed to glow in the afternoon light as Morrison continued his story. That's when Elias came to me. I was already on the wrong side of the law cattle rustling, mostly, taking back what the railroad had stolen from my family's ranch. But Elias, he was different. He wasn't looking for money or land. He was looking for justice that the law had denied him. What happened to Dr. Webb? Wittman asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Found dead in his office 6 months later, single gunshot, clean through the heart. No witnesses, no evidence, but everybody knew. That was Elias's first kill, and it was justice, pure and simple. Nora's hands trembled as she held the photograph, seeing not the feared outlaw of legend, but a young father whose love had been transformed into vengeance by the very system that was supposed to protect him. And the judge? Killed in what looked like a stagecoach robbery. But nothing was taken, not money, not jewelry, nothing. Just a corrupt judge who'd sold his conscience for railroad gold. The pieces of Elias Kincaid's transformation fell into place like a terrible puzzle. A man driven to outlawry, not by greed or natural violence, but by the systematic corruption of the institutions that should have offered him protection and justice. The rest of it, the bank robberies, the train holdups, that was about something bigger, Morrison explained. Elias figured if the law wouldn't protect honest folks from being robbed by banks and railroads, maybe honest outlaws could balance the scales. Every bank we hit had foreclosed on family farms. Every train we stopped was carrying money stolen from settlers through crooked land deals. Colonel Wittman's badge seemed to grow heavier with each revelation. His 30 years of unwavering faith in legal authority were crumbling as he confronted the possibility that sometimes the law itself was the greatest criminal. You're telling me that Elias Kincaid, the most wanted man in 3 territories, was created by the very system I've spent my career defending? I'm telling you that my brother-in-law was a good man who watched the law murder his family and steal his future. What would you have done, Colonel? The question hung in the air like smoke from the outlaw campfires, demanding an answer that Wittman wasn't prepared to give. Around them, the canyon waited in silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant murmur of 700 men who'd followed a man they now understood even better than before. Nora looked down at the photograph again, seeing little Hannah's laughing face, and remembering her own unborn child stirring beneath her heart. What would she do if corruption disguised as law stole everything she loved? How far would she go to seek justice in a world where justice had been auctioned to the highest bidder? "There's something else," Morrison said quietly, pulling one final item from the saddlebag. It was a letter, yellowed with age but carefully preserved, written in a child's uncertain hand. "Dear Papa, Mama says you are sad, but I love you very much, and when I grow up I will make you happy again. Your loving daughter, Hannah." The letter had been carried for 20 years, through countless robberies and gunfights, a talisman of love that had sustained a man through 2 decades of violence. It was stained with what might have been tears, worn soft by handling, treasured beyond any gold or silver the outlaw had ever stolen. As Nora read Hannah's innocent words, she understood finally why 700 dangerous men had gathered to honor their leader's peaceful death. They hadn't just lost a criminal mastermind, they'd lost a man who'd shown them that even in the depths of justified rage, love could survive. The photograph, the documents, the child's letter together, they transformed Elias Kincaid from legendary outlaw to tragic hero, a man whose crimes were born not from evil, but from love, perverted by injustice. And in that transformation, everyone in the Canyon Outlaw and lawmen alike was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice, the corruption of law, and the terrible price of a society that valued order over mercy. Colonel Wittman stared at his polished badge, and for the first time in 30 years, wondered whether he'd been wearing a symbol of justice or a mark of complicity in a system that created its own enemies through calculated cruelty. The unfinished baby blanket lay across Nora's lap like a promise of hope amid the growing tension that filled the canyon like thunderclouds gathering before a storm. She'd been knitting it during the long winter evenings after Thomas's death, each careful stitch a prayer for the child she would raise alone. The soft yellow wool chosen because she didn't know whether she carried a son or daughter had absorbed her tears during the darkest nights of grief and now seemed to glow with its own gentle light. As word of Kincaid's true story spread through both camps, the carefully maintained peace began to fracture along unexpected lines. Some of Wittman's deputies, hardened men who'd never questioned their orders, found themselves unable to reconcile their duty with the growing understanding that they might be the real criminals in this strange drama. Meanwhile, among the outlaws, voices were raised in heated debate about what their leader's death meant for their future. The baby blanket's simple pattern-alternating squares of plain and pearl stitches reminded Nora of the patchwork quilt that had started everything. Both represented the patient work of love, the belief that small acts of care could create something beautiful and lasting. Now, as her pregnancy entered its final weeks and her body prepared for the monumental task of bringing new life into this troubled world, the half-finished blanket seemed to symbolize everything uncertain about the future. Margaret Kelly had remained at Nora's side through the escalating crisis, her midwife's instincts alert to every sign that stress might trigger premature labor. The older woman's practical nature had been shaken by the revelations about Kincaid's past, forcing her to confront her own assumptions about justice and criminality. "I keep thinking about that little girl," Margaret confessed as she checked Nora's pulse and blood pressure. "Hannah, she'd be 24 now if she'd lived. Maybe married, maybe with children of her own. Instead, her death turned her father into an outlaw and created this whole tragedy. And now 700 men who followed him are about to decide whether to honor his memory with violence or with something else." Nora replied, feeling another strong kick from the baby. "I can feel this little one responding to all the tension. It's like they know something important is happening." Through the window, they could see the careful choreography of armed camps preparing for potential conflict. Wittman's men had constructed defensive positions along the south rim, their military training evident in the precise placement of barriers and ammunition reserves. The outlaws, by contrast, moved with the fluid adaptability of men who'd spent years evading capture, their positions shifting constantly to maintain tactical advantage. But it was the conversations happening within each camp that truly mattered. Jake Morrison had become the unofficial spokesman for the Outlaws, moving from group to group with Kincaid's photograph and documents, ensuring that every man understood the full scope of their leader's transformation from grieving father to legendary criminal. The response was complex and emotional anger at the system that had created their circumstances, grief for the innocence that had been stolen from them all, and a growing sense that Kincaid's peaceful death offered them a chance for redemption they'd never imagined possible. "The boys are split," Morrison reported during one of his visits to the dugout. "About half want to ride out peaceful-like, scatter to the winds, and try to build new lives somewhere the law won't follow. The other half figure this is their chance to go out fighting, take as many badges with them as they can." "And you?" Nora asked, noting the exhaustion in the older man's weathered features. "What do you think Elias would want?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his hands working the brim of his hat. 20 years ago, when he first came to me after losing Sarah and Hannah, Elias said something I never forgot. He said, "Jake, I'm going to make them pay for what they took from me. But someday, somehow, I want this to mean something more than just revenge. I want Sarah and Hannah's deaths to count for something good." "And do they count for something good?" "That depends on what happens next. If we ride out shooting, if we turn this canyon into a graveyard, then all we've done is prove that violence only breeds more violence. But if we find another way," Morrison gestured toward the baby blanket in Nora's lap, "if we can honor Elias's memory by protecting new life instead of destroying it, maybe that's how Sarah and Hannah finally get their justice." Meanwhile, Colonel Wittman faced his own crisis of conscience. The photograph of Kincaid's family had shattered his certainty about frontier justice, forcing him to confront the possibility that his entire career had been built on a foundation of legal corruption disguised as righteous order. His deputies watched him with growing concern as their unshakable commander struggled with doubts that threatened to paralyze his decision-making. "Sir," Marshal Brennan approached cautiously, "the men are asking for orders. Do we move against the outlaws or maintain position?" Wittman stared at the polished badge on his chest, seeing it now as a weight that had grown unbearable. "Marshal, in your years of service, have you ever questioned whether we might be the ones on the wrong side of justice?" The question clearly disturbed Brennan, who'd built his own career on unwavering faith in legal authority. "Sir, these men are criminals. The law is clear about our duty." "Is it? If the law itself is corrupt, if the system we serve creates the very criminals we're supposed to stop, what does that make us?" Brennan had no answer, and Wittman could see his own crisis of faith reflected in the younger man's troubled expression. Around them, 50 armed deputies waited for orders that their commander was no longer certain he had the moral authority to give. As afternoon faded toward evening, a new element entered the volatile situation. A lone rider appeared on the eastern horizon, approaching at a gallop that spoke of urgent news. The messenger was one of Wittman's own men, sent days earlier to report the situation to territorial headquarters and request additional support. "Colonel," the rider called as he reined in his lathered horse, "orders from the governor, sir. You're to end this standoff immediately, by any means necessary. He's sending 3 companies of cavalry to ensure compliance." The news struck both camps like lightning. 3 companies meant 300 fresh soldiers, enough to overwhelm even 700 outlaws through superior discipline and equipment. More importantly, it meant that the delicate balance of the current standoff would soon be shattered by forces beyond anyone's local control. "How long before they arrive?" Wittman asked, though he dreaded the answer. 2 days, sir. Maybe less if they push hard." Nora felt her baby kick urgently as the implications became clear. In 48 hours, this canyon would become a battlefield unless some resolution could be found. The unfinished blanket in her lap seemed to mock her hopes for bringing new life into a world determined to solve its problems through violence. Margaret Kelly's face had gone pale as she calculated the medical implications. "Nora, the stress of a battle could trigger immediate labor. At 8 months, the baby might survive, but without proper facilities. The threat didn't need to be completed." Everyone understood that gunfire and chaos were no environment for childbirth, that the violence threatening to engulf the canyon could easily claim 2 innocent lives, along with whatever combatants fell in the fighting. As darkness fell and campfires bloomed along both rims of the canyon, the 3 groups outlaws, lawmen, and the pregnant widow who'd brought them together faced the reality that their time for finding a peaceful solution was running out. The baby blanket's soft yellow wool seemed to absorb the firelight, glowing like a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the night, 700 desperate men wrestled with the choice between violence and redemption, while 50 confused deputies struggled to understand their duty in a situation where right and wrong had become impossibly tangled. At the center of it all, a woman prepared to bring new life into the world, while praying that the world would prove worthy of that gift. The unfinished blanket lay across Nora's swollen belly, its incomplete pattern waiting for the careful hands that would someday complete it. Like the standoff itself, like the future that hung in the balance, it remained a work in progress, a testament to the patient faith that love, given time and care, could create something beautiful even in the midst of chaos. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could change the course of frontier justice forever. Tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of the dugout, 3 generations of women's stitches held together a quilt that had covered a dying outlaw, while nearby, a 4th generation prepared to add their own threads to the complex tapestry of mercy and hope. Dawn broke grey and cold over the canyon, bringing with it the distant thunder of approaching cavalry. The sound reached the assembled camps like a death knell, spurring both sides into final preparations for what seemed an inevitable confrontation. Through her window, Nora could see men checking weapons and taking final positions, their movements sharp with the tension of warriors preparing for battle. But it was the white fabric in her hands that commanded her attention, a piece of her wedding dress that she'd carefully cut during the night while Margaret dozed in the rocking chair. The fine cotton had been imported from New Orleans for her marriage to Thomas 24 years ago, and she'd treasured it through 2 decades of frontier life. Now, transformed into a flag of truce, it represented her final attempt to prevent the slaughter that political authority demanded. "You can't seriously be thinking of walking out there," Margaret protested as she woke to find Nora tying the white fabric to one of Thomas's walking sticks. "Those cavalry units will be here within hours. Any negotiations need to happen between the military commanders." "The military commanders aren't interested in negotiations," Nora replied, her voice steady despite the fear that clutched at her heart. "They're interested in making examples. Someone needs to speak for mercy before it's too late." Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison climbing down from the north rim, his weathered face grim with purpose. Behind him, the outlaw camps were stirring with the kind of purposeful activity that spoke of men preparing for their final stand. Morrison's knock was gentle but urgent. When Nora opened the door, she was struck by the change in his appearance. The grizzled outlaw who'd first introduced himself days ago had been replaced by a man who carried himself with dignity and quiet resolution. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat, "the boys have made their decision. We're going to surrender." The words hung in the morning air like a miracle. Margaret gasped, and Nora felt her baby kick as if responding to the sudden shift in tension. "All of them?" Nora asked. "Every man. 700 of the most wanted criminals in 3 territories, laying down their guns and accepting whatever justice the law wants to hand out." Morrison's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. Elias would have been proud. They chose honor over violence. But why now? What changed their minds? Morrison gestured toward the white flag in Nora's hands. "They know what you're planning to do, ma'am. Word travels fast in an outlaw camp." The boys figured if a pregnant woman was brave enough to walk into no man's land, carrying a flag made from her wedding dress, maybe they could find the courage to face justice without spilling any more blood. The surrender should have solved everything, but as Nora looked toward the south rim where Colonel Wittman's forces waited, she realized that the approaching cavalry complicated matters beyond anyone's ability to control. The territorial governor's orders had been clear: end the standoff by any means necessary. A peaceful surrender might not satisfy the political need for a dramatic demonstration of authority. Colonel Wittman's a decent man, Morrison continued, but he's not in command anymore. Those cavalry officers answer to politicians who want headlines about crushing outlaw resistance. They won't care that we're surrendering. Understanding flooded through Nora with terrible clarity. The outlaws' decision to choose peace over violence might mean nothing if the arriving military forces were determined to stage a massacre for political theater. Someone needed to reach the cavalry commanders before they arrived, needed to explain that the crisis had been resolved through means other than bloodshed. "Then I need to reach them before they get here," Nora said, struggling to her feet despite her advanced pregnancy. "If I can meet them on the road, explain what's happened." "Ma'am, with respect, you're in no condition to ride anywhere," Morrison interrupted. "And those cavalry units aren't going to listen to a woman, especially one who's been harboring fugitives." "Then what do you suggest?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from the white flag to Nora's determined face. "Maybe we don't need to reach them. Maybe we need to make sure they understand the situation before they reach us." "How?" "The same way you stopped a war between outlaws and lawmen, ma'am. With mercy, with truth, and with the kind of courage that shames men into remembering what they're supposed to stand for." As if summoned by their conversation, Colonel Wittman appeared at the dugout's entrance. The territorial administrator looked as though he'd aged years in the past few days, his rigid military bearing softened by the weight of moral uncertainty. "Mrs. McBride," he said formally, "I've received word that the outlaws intend to surrender. Is this true?" "It is," Morrison confirmed. "Every man, Colonel. No resistance, no conditions. They're willing to face whatever justice you think they deserve." Wittman's relief was visible, but it was tempered by obvious concern. "The problem is that my authority has been superseded. The cavalry units approaching this canyon have orders to demonstrate territorial power through overwhelming force. A peaceful surrender may not serve their political objectives." The three adults stood in silence, contemplating the tragic irony that peace itself had become an obstacle to the political theater that frontier governance required. Outside, 700 men prepared to lay down their weapons in the first mass surrender in territorial history, while 300 cavalry approached with orders to crush resistance that no longer existed. It was then that Nora felt the first unmistakable contraction, sharp and urgent, signaling that her child had chosen this moment of crisis to begin the journey into the world. The letter had been written in Elias Kincaid's final moments, his hand growing weaker with each word as life ebbed from his body. Jake Morrison discovered it tucked beneath the outlaw leader's vest, the paper stained with blood, but the words still legible in Kincaid's careful script. "My faithful brothers," Morrison read aloud as both camps gathered in the canyon below, drawn by the white flag that Nora had planted in the earth between them. "If you are reading this, then the reckoning I have long expected has finally come. I pray that my death brings peace rather than more violence, for I have grown weary of the hatred that has sustained me for 20 years. The assembled outlaws listened in absolute silence, their weathered faces reflecting the grief of men who had lost more than a leader. They had lost a father figure who had given purpose to their exile from civilized society. Many wept openly as Morrison continued reading the final testament of the man they had followed across 3 territories. "I know that some of you will want to avenge my death, but I ask you to choose a different path. Sarah and Hannah would not want their memory honored with more bloodshed. Instead, I ask you to remember the mercy shown to me in my final moments by a woman whose name I do not even know. Let her kindness be the seed of your redemption." Colonel Wittman stood beside his own men, the polished badge on his chest, catching the morning light as he listened to words that challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal justice. His deputies shifted uneasily, their certainty about right and wrong eroded by the revelation that their most wanted fugitive had died, asking for peace rather than revenge. "The life we have lived together," Morrison continued reading, has been born of necessity and sustained by loyalty. But it has also been shaped by pain that we never allowed to heal. Perhaps it is time to choose healing over hatred, to build something instead of always destroying. Nora sat in her rocking chair, which had been carried outside so she could witness this unprecedented gathering. Margaret Kelly remained at her side, monitoring the increasingly frequent contractions that signaled her baby's imminent arrival. The unfinished yellow blanket lay across her lap, its soft wool absorbing the tears that she couldn't hold back as she listened to the words of a man she had known only in his final moments. "To the law enforcement officers who will surely come," Morrison read, his voice growing stronger as he shared his leader's final wishes. "I ask that you see these men not as irredeemable criminals but as human beings who were failed by the system they chose to fight. Many of them were driven to outlawry by the same corruption that transformed me from a grieving father into a wanted fugitive." The approaching thunder of cavalry hooves grew louder, but no one moved to take defensive positions. The power of Kincaid's final words had created a moment of peace that transcended the political demands for violence and retribution. "And to the woman who showed me mercy when the world had shown me none," Morrison continued, his eyes finding Nora's face, "I leave my most precious possession not gold or silver, but the memory of my daughter Hannah's laughter. May your own child grow up in a world where kindness is valued more than vengeance, where mercy triumphs over the machinery of hate." A sharp contraction made Nora gasp, and Margaret immediately began timing the intervals between pains. The baby was coming, whether the world was ready or not. "There is a choice before all of us," Morrison concluded, his voice carrying across the canyon with the authority of a man delivering a sacred trust. "We can continue the cycle of violence that has claimed so many lives, or we can choose to honor the mercy shown to our leader by creating something better. I choose mercy. I choose hope. I choose to believe that even the hardest men can find redemption through love." The letter was signed simply E. Kincaid, followed by a postscript that made even hardened outlaws weep. "Tell them that Sarah and Hannah's papa died grateful for kindness." As Morrison folded the blood-stained paper, the thunder of approaching cavalry reached a crescendo. 3 companies of territorial soldiers crested the eastern ridge in perfect military formation, their sabers glinting in the morning sun and their battle flags snapping in the wind. At their head rode Major General William Kuster, the territorial governor's own appointee, sent to demonstrate federal authority through overwhelming force. But instead of finding 2 armies poised for battle, Kuster encountered something unprecedented in frontier warfare. 700 outlaws and 50 lawmen standing together in peaceful assembly around a pregnant woman in labor and a white flag made from a wedding dress. The general's confusion was evident as he surveyed the scene. His orders had been explicit: crush outlaw resistance with maximum violence, to send a message throughout the territories that criminal defiance would not be tolerated. Instead, he found his enemies already surrendered and his supposed allies questioning the wisdom of the violence he'd been sent to deliver. "Colonel Wittman," Kuster's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to unquestioned obedience, "explain this situation immediately." Wittman stepped forward, his own badge seeming smaller and less significant beside the general's elaborate uniform and decorations. "Sir, the situation has resolved itself through peaceful surrender. All fugitives have agreed to face justice without resistance." Peaceful surrender? Kuster's tone suggested that peace was the last thing he wanted to find. "My orders are to demonstrate territorial authority through decisive action. A surrender serves no political purpose." It was then that Jake Morrison stepped forward, Kincaid's letter still in his weathered hands. "General, with respect, maybe it's time politics served justice instead of the other way around." The confrontation that followed might have escalated into the very violence everyone had worked to prevent. But it was interrupted by a sound that transcended all political and military concerns, the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby taking its first breath. Nora's child had chosen this moment to enter the world, arriving amid the most extraordinary gathering in frontier history. Margaret Kelly's competent hands guided the birth while 700 outlaws, 50 lawmen, and 300 cavalry soldiers stood in awed silence, witnessing the arrival of new life in a place where death had seemed inevitable. As Margaret lifted the Babia girl, perfect and beautiful, into the morning light, something fundamental shifted in the canyon. The cries of an innocent child stripped away pretense and politics, reducing every armed man present to his essential humanity. "She's beautiful," Morrison whispered, and his words were echoed by gruff voices throughout both camps. General Kuster sat frozen in his saddle, his orders for decisive violence rendered meaningless by the reality of birth and hope. Around him, his cavalry soldiers lowered their weapons without command, their military discipline overcome by the primal recognition that they were witnessing something sacred. The baby's cries filled the canyon like a song of hope, and in that moment, every person present understood that they faced a choice between honoring new life or destroying it in service to old hatreds. Kincaid's letter had planted the seed of redemption, but it was his daughter's entrance into the world that brought that redemption to full flower. As Nora held her newborn daughter to her breast, the unfinished yellow blanket finally found its purpose, wrapping the child in warmth that had been knitted with love through the long winter nights of grief and hope. The cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives paused in the presence of absolute innocence, and in that pause, mercy found its voice. 5 years later, the community that grew around Nora's Canyon had become something unprecedented in territorial history: settlement, built on second chances and sustained by the memory of mercy shown to a dying outlaw. The quilt that covered little Sarah Hannah McBride's bed was unlike any other in the territory. Its squares had been contributed by former outlaws who'd chosen redemption over violence, each piece telling a story of transformation that few would have believed possible. Jake Morrison had contributed blue denim from his old outlaw days, now living peacefully as the settlement's blacksmith. Tom Brady, once wanted for train robbery, had given soft cotton from the shirts he wore while teaching school to children whose parents had once feared his name. The pattern emerging from these diverse contributions was the wedding ring design that Nora's mother had taught, her interlocking circles, representing the unbroken bonds of love and community. But this version carried deeper meaning, each ring connecting former enemies in a tapestry of forgiveness that stretched across the canyon like a promise of hope. Colonel Wittman's badge had found a new home in the community's small museum, displayed alongside Kincaid's photograph and final letter as artifacts of the day when mercy triumphed over the machinery of territorial justice. Wittman himself had resigned his commission and now served as the settlement's magistrate, administering a form of restorative justice that emphasized healing over punishment. "I spent 30 years learning how to break men," he often told visitors who came to study their unprecedented experiment in frontier redemption. "Here, I'm learning how to help them rebuild themselves." The museum also displayed the wanted posters that had once papered territorial offices, now framed beside photographs of the same men building homes, raising families, and contributing to a community that valued transformation over condemnation. The contrast was striking: faces that had once radiated hardness and desperation, now showing the peace that comes from belonging somewhere good. General Kuster's official report had been a masterpiece of military diplomacy, describing the situation as a strategic pacification achieved through innovative negotiation techniques. The territorial governor, initially frustrated by the lack of dramatic violence for political theater, eventually claimed credit for pioneering a new approach to frontier law enforcement. Politics, as always, found ways to transform even mercy into opportunity. But the real success was measured in smaller ways. The settlement school, built by men whose hands had once known only violence, educated children in both academic subjects and the practical skills of community building. The church, constructed from stone quarried by former train robbers, hosted weddings between outlaws and local women who'd chosen to see redemption over reputation. Margaret Kelly had stayed to become the settlement's first doctor, Her midwife's training expanded through correspondence courses that prepared her to serve a growing population. Her clinic, funded by former bank robbers who'd discovered legitimate ways to use their understanding of finance, provided medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. The economic foundation of the community rested on innovations that only men with outlaw experience could have devised. Former rustlers had developed new techniques for cattle management that prevented legitimate ranchers from losing stock to harsh weather. Ex-train robbers had designed security systems for legitimate businesses that proved remarkably effective at preventing actual crime. Jake Morrison's blacksmith shop had become the heart of the settlement's economy, producing tools and ironwork that were sought after throughout the territory. His specialty was crafting intricate metalwork that incorporated religious and family symbols, each piece a meditation on the possibility of transformation. The anvil where he worked had been forged from melted-down weapons, surrendered by his former criminal associate Tesswords, literally beaten into plowshares. The woman at the center of it all had aged gracefully into her role as the settlement's unofficial matriarch. Nora McBride's quiet strength and practical wisdom provided stability for a community built on the radical premise that even the hardest men could change. Her daughter Sarah Hannah had grown into a bright 5-year-old who played without fear among men who'd once been the territory's most dangerous criminals. The child's presence had proven transformative in ways no one had anticipated. Former outlaws who'd forgotten how to be gentle rediscovered tenderness through their interactions with Sarah Hannah. Her innocent questions about their past lives forced them to articulate their transformations in ways that deepened their own understanding of the changes they'd undergone. "Why were you sad before you came here?" she'd asked Tom Brady one afternoon as he helped her with arithmetic lessons. "Because I forgot that people could be kind," he'd answered, and in that simple exchange, both teacher and student had learned something profound about the nature of redemption. The settlement's success had attracted attention from throughout the territory and beyond. Delegations of officials, reformers, and curiosity seekers made pilgrimages to study their unprecedented experiment in frontier justice. Most left convinced that the model could be replicated elsewhere, though few had the courage to attempt such radical departures from conventional law enforcement. The original quilt the wedding ring pattern that had covered Elias Kincaid's body in his final moment hung in the settlement's community hall as a reminder of the mercy that had started everything. Children were taught its story as part of their local history lessons, learning that kindness could be more powerful than violence, that mercy could triumph over the machinery of hate. As evening settled over the canyon, Nora often sat in her rocking chair on the porch of the larger house the community had built for her, watching her daughter play with children whose fathers had once been wanted men. The mountain walls that had once seemed to isolate her now felt protective, sheltering a community that proved daily that people could change, that love was indeed stronger than fear. The unfinished baby blanket had finally been completed, its soft yellow wool now covering a 5-year-old who carried her father's gentle spirit and her mother's quiet strength. But more importantly, the pattern of mercy that had begun with one woman's simple act of kindness had been woven into the very fabric of a community that stood as testament to the transformative power of love. In the distance, the sound of hammers and saws continued as former outlaws built homes for new families, each nail driven with the conviction that redemption was not just possible but inevitable when mercy was given room to grow. The cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives had finally been broken, replaced by a cycle of healing that would echo through generations yet to come.